All right, we got a few folks still connecting to audio and joining. I'll give it one more minute here. Somebody has a really beautiful painting for their, oh, Norma, that's beautiful, Norma. All right, a couple more. More folks trickling in. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning. Welcome to today's coffee break. I'm Louise Mistel. I'm the Executive Director at Sky Island Alliance, if I don't know you yet. Today, we will be hearing from Sky Island Alliance staff about what we've learned over the last year of our border wildlife study. We've got lots of data to talk about and observations to share with you this morning. And I've got a few introductory items before we get started with the border wildlife study. So first of all, we want to thank all of our volunteers, supporters, and donors, folks just like you. Many of you I know are volunteers and donors who continue to support, whose support allows us to continue offering this programming and do this really important work to protect our wildlife corridors and our water sources. And if you're new to Sky Island Alliance, please visit our website to learn more about our work. We've got all of our projects up there, and you can see more about what we're doing in Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. Just a note that we will be recording the coffee break this morning. So it will be placed up on our website later today, so you can share this with your friends and family and get them excited about the wonderful wildlife in the Sky Islands, if they're not yet. And if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat box. And if you're on joining us from Facebook Live, we'll be monitoring questions and comments that you leave there as well. So we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, and we'd love to answer your questions. And finally, before we get started, I want to acknowledge the privilege we have to be here in this region today. The Sky Island Alliance office here in Tucson, where I'm speaking to you from, is on the land of Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui and other indigenous people. Our work throughout the Sky Island region on both sides of the border takes place on indigenous land. And at Sky Island Alliance, we're working to acknowledge the lack of truth and reconciliation with Native nations. And our organization is committed to continuing to educate ourselves about this process and mobilizing to stand in solidarity with present-day tribes and support Indigenous people who are acting to restore their rights and protect this land that we call home. So with that, I will turn it over to Emily Burns, Program Director, to get us started. And I hope you enjoy this tour of the wonderful wildlife and wild places of the borderlands.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Louise, and thank you all for joining us this morning to talk about wildlife at the U.S. Mexico border. It's been a really, really big year, for our organization, I think for all of us individually who have been part of this project. And it's really an honor to be able to sit together today and reflect back on all of the amazing things that we've learned. It's had a lot of ups and downs, and we're going to be showing a lot of those to you through figures and graphs. We're also going to be sharing some of the personal anecdotes that we've collected along the journey as a field team. I'm going to begin by giving an overview, some context for how this project came to be at Sky Island Alliance. And then I'm going to share with you what the study design is. And some of you are already familiar with that, but we're going to review what that study design looks like. Then I'm going to pass it off to Paolo Quadri, who's our conservation director, and he's going to walk through some of the really interesting results that we've found, the patterns in the data that have emerged over the last year. We're going to be hearing from Zoe Fulham, who's our community science manager. She's been working every week for the last year in the border wildlife study field area, coordinating with volunteers. And she's going to share a little bit of one of the chronic issues that we've dealt with in maintaining our cameras. It has to do with cattle. And then we're also going to hear from Megan Bethel, who's our wildlife specialist, and she's going to share some of the other things that we've learned from these photographs that have happened over the years that's not related necessarily directly to wildlife. At the very end, I'll come back on and I'm going to talk with you about where we go from here with this project and put it in the context of what actually is happening with border policy and the status of wall construction along both the stretch where we're doing our study, the border, and also across the whole US Mexico border. And at the end, we'll take questions. Okay, so the beginning, where did this project all start? Well, in fall of 2019, I can barely remember that far back. It was like 10,000 years ago before COVID. I had the opportunity to go to the border and what you can see here, the beautiful oak woodlands in the Patagonia Mountains, and see the current state of border infrastructure. And what you can see in front of you in this photograph is the steel vehicle barrier barbed wire fence. And this is the kind of barrier that was put along a lot of Arizona in the last couple of decades to mark the international line in the sand, if you will. And we visited, I went with Brian Lichtenhan, who is our stewardship specialist and an expert tracker. And we spent the day looking down at our feet and looking at what evidence was in the dusty road, the border road. One of the most amazing things about the road environment along the border is that it's an excellent clue keeper. We see all kinds of tracks and prints of animals that are on the move in this area. And it was a fascinating and really mind-opening day for me to see how many different species we were finding the tracks from, the paw prints from, right at the US Mexico border. During just about 6 hours walking together, we saw tracks from over 30 different species. And one in particular was a muddy patch right under the border fence. We found American black bear, a track moving south. It was oriented south under Mexico. Clearly that bear walked through the mud within the last week before we were there and went under the barbed wire fence. And for me, it was just this pivotal moment of, wow, American black bear are here in Southeast Arizona and they're moving into Mexico. They're walking through our mountains, between our mountains. And it was happening at a time where we were reading more and more in the news about construction happening on the border and laws being waived. As the months clicked forward, it became clear to us that this corridor between the Patagonia Mountains and the Huachuca Mountains is a really incredible wildlife corridor. So species like this black bear, we knew were moving from Sky Island's previous tracking work and their camera work in the region. But we needed to do more. Our fear, because 84 different federal laws and statutes were being waived along the US Mexico border, is that it was going to become increasingly easy for the previous administration to initiate new border wall construction contracts. And we knew that this region was at serious risk of wall construction. So, motivated by this bear footprint and the realization that species like the black bear really are dependent on international connectivity within our Sky Island region. The map that you're looking at here shows the historic range of black bear across the US and Mexico area in red. The blue line indicates the current US Mexico border. And where you see the red is where black bear historically was abundant and moved throughout this area. The orange color shows the restricted areas where black bear is present today. And these tiny dots here are where our border wildlife study was happening. And we realized there were so few spots where black bear were occurring. And for them to be able to repopulate back into Mexico, keeping this connectivity corridor open was critical. And we really wanted to document the presence of species in this place and champion the protection of this corridor. And so the border wildlife study was born out of this idea. And here was the first picture of a black bear that we saw in our border wildlife study cameras. I remember the day when Megan shared it to us online. She's like, look, we got our first bear. It was from April of 2020. And it really just, I don't know if it was the bear that left the footprint, but it really started to feel like, okay, let's do this. Let's document these animals. Let's tell the story, and let's stand up to protect this wildlife corridor. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the wildlife community design that we set up along 30 miles of the border, and then hand it over to Paolo to talk about the patterns and species richness and other factors in this study zone. So one of the critical pieces of how we set up the study was following a systematic camera design, meaning that without bias, we placed our cameras along a transect parallel to the U.S. Mexico border, where cameras are spaced in every other grid cell in the fashion of this team terrestrial vertebrate monitoring protocol. This is an international standard for how to monitor the wildlife community composed of medium and large mammals. So wildlife cameras are becoming increasingly more sensitive and able to detect a whole range of species, which we will talk about. But this protocol is really optimized to be able to detect mammals that both have small ranges and large wide-ranging species like black bear and mountain lion. You can see in this map the yellow area where our study zone is. You can see that the Santa Cruz River crosses right south into Mexico in the middle of our study site. And we have cameras, some of our cameras are also in a grid on the south side of the border at Rancho Los Fresnos. And we are indebted to Naturalia, our partners, who have been maintaining these cameras over the last year. So here's what the camera locations actually look like. If you were standing at Coronado National Memorial on the ridge here at Montezuma Pass, next to these blue dots, and facing this direction, facing west, this is the view you would have looking at the landscape. And the white lines are the polygon of the U.S. field component of our study site. It transitions looking this way, going through Coronado National Forest in the Huachuca Mountains. Then it goes into state parkland here in the San Rafael Valley, and then up into the Patagonia Mountains. The red dots are the Mexican cameras that I mentioned at Rancho Los Fresnos. And we're really excited that we're going to be expanding our study site to the east into Coronado National Memorial, National Park Service land in the coming weeks. The cameras are grouped into blocks of 8. So you will hear us talk about blocks. And what that means are the cameras within smaller grids located in different zones of our border wildlife study area. The cameras are strapped to creative places. They are mostly attached to oak trees that are scattered across the landscape like this one. Sometimes in the grasslands, they are mounted on posts. And then the creativity piece here, sometimes they're attached to old flowering stalks of plant like this sotol. These cameras are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And across the grid, we have 58 distributed camera points. They're distributed in such a way across the habitat that we feel we're adequately sampling the variation in the types of habitat. And we're really going to talk about the patterns we're seeing, how different parts of the border are along this 30-mile stretch. But we feel like because we've spaced these cameras out in the way we have, we're going to be getting great insight into the wildlife community in grassland and oak woodland and other types of habitat features. And you're going to learn more about that. These cameras have been taking photos very often. 2 million photographs or more have been filtered and analyzed over the course of the last year. And they're not all wildlife photos. These cameras are very sensitive to movement, and so they do detect moving vegetation in the wind. So a lot of the photos that we collected have been of the vegetation itself. We've also detected humans and cattle, and we're going to talk about those detections. But if you filter out the moving vegetation, the domesticated animals like livestock and dogs and people and vehicles, what we were left with was an amazing set of over 20,000 wildlife detections. We had almost as many cattle detections and very few human detections. And we wanted to share these numbers up front so you can understand that of the actual detections that we've had, most have been wildlife. Okay, well, with this, let's talk about what we've actually learned from all of these amazing camera photos. And I'm going to pass it off to Paolo. He's going to take over the presentation.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much. And thanks, everyone. Welcome to my screen now. That translation, the Spanish subtitles were great. So it will be the real challenge for Microsoft now with my accent. We'll see if it's the same. So just a second. You can see my screen now?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Well, let's start with the party, center of the party, which is talk about the species richness that we found with our data. And so in a lot of the graphs that I'm going to show you, what you'll see is that the blocks, as Emily was saying, which are these groups of cameras, of 8 cameras, they're aggregated by these general regions, right, that are part of the study. And so block 10 and block 11, they belong to the region of the Patagonia Mountains, and block 12 and 13 to the lower portion, the lower portion of the study in elevation, which is the San Rafael Valley, and block 14, 15 to the Huachuca Mountains, and block 16 on the Mexican side is just across the Huachuca Mountains, but it's a little bit lower elevation. So what you see here is the total number of species by block and region, and so you can see how they're very similar, except for the block 16 in Mexico, because there were some issues with cows, like trampling, like moving the cameras around, and so that's something that we've been working on correcting these past months. But so you can see the number of species by each section. Now, what about taxons? What you've seen here is these general taxa that we grouped: reptiles, mammals, insects, birds, and arachnids, and just like just a little bit of them. And again, you can see there the sort of the spatial direction. So block 11, so that is the eastern side of the Patagonia Mountains. Have these are number of detections of these taxons, so they have the biggest amount of detections. But you can see how the composition is a bit different. And so block 13 in San Rafael Valley, which it doesn't have a lot of detections, but it's actually more even in terms of the taxons that it's detecting. But then, of course, these cameras are designed for mammal detection, and so mammals take the big chunk of the type of taxonomic groups. And the kind of stuff that we detect, some of the species that run the show in the area, like the mountain lion, the tricksters all around, pretty much everywhere, coyotes, the mule deer, right? Not as common as their cousins, the white-tailed deer, but we see them often. Road runners, American kestrel, just really looking at you. These scary claws belong to the red-tailed hawk. And this is a Clark's spiny lizard that, again, these cameras would probably detect much more reptiles, or the study would have, but there is a bias, of course, in the way the cameras work and how they're set up as they are designed to get mammals. And these are pipevine butterflies, which, again, we still see a lot of other taxonomic groups that, even though they're not designed, the camera's not designed for them. Now, there is an important distinction between, in terms of the community composition that we see and how it changes over time, and we'll talk about the seasonality too. But the first thing to talk about is how it changes during 24 hours, right? And a lot of the species, and probably know these, like they like the nightlife. And they're nocturnal. And so what this graph is showing you, this is on the y-axis, that's the percent of nocturnal detections. And then you can see a list of these are just mammals. So these are on the x-axis, and you can see everything that is blue on top. That's 100% of those species were seen at night. So we didn't see any of those hours that are considered, during the day that the urinal. And then you can see how some, like the Arizona gray squirrel, like some of the squirrels and the white-nosed coati, you will find them mostly during the day, not entirely, but mostly during day hours. So that's some of the niche partitioning happening during 24 hours. And this is really important. We'll talk about why this is really key in terms of what is happening in the region in terms of anthropogenic impacts. Some of the species that we see at night that are not only nocturnal but really cute too are the North American porcupine, which we were really surprised to find here once it showed up in their study, and the Virginia opossum. So these guys definitely like to hang out at night. And the reason why understanding these proportions and how these animals have these different functions based on the time of the day is because the impacts that we've been talking to you about the border wall are not only the problem with the habitat fragmentation, but also about light pollution, right? So to complement this study with the cameras, we decided, and I said this is Emily just wanted me to jump here, but she's been the architect of all this research in terms of exploring the night at the border wall, and so big kudos for her. And so what we did here is that we took measurements along the border, not just in the area of the border wildlife study, but also closer to the east to Douglas and Agua Prieta, and further to the west, to take measurements of light pollution. Sorry, let me just. And this is a methodology that is followed, that is established by Globe at Night to measure nighttime sky quality across this area. Along the flanking borders regions, that's 84 miles. So staff and volunteers took collected data, something called stellar magnitude readings, right, during the night. And what happens here is that using both visual assessments, so just basically looking at the night sky, to see how many dim stars were visible in the constellation of Leo, and then taking technical measurements using a sky quality meter. So those are two different ways of knowing what's happening in terms of light pollution. And so that allows to map where the most and least light pollution is affecting nocturnal environment. Here you would be looking at Nogales. So if you're standing looking at the west, and so one of the main findings here is that both city and border wall lights, because sorry, I didn't mention that, but the main goal here was because there's been a lot of light infrastructure being built around the massive roads that they've been building because of the border wall, not just the ones that are in the periphery of the cities. Especially around Douglas, Naco, and Nogales, created a significant amount of light pollution, reducing the sky quality at night. So even though the border wildlife study is in an area that is not, it's dark enough, right? It's largely unlighted, and protected from sky glow cast by the mountains. The borderlands on either side are affected by border wall lining. So that the border wall was encroaching toward this area. It was illuminating these landscapes and increasing pollution. And you saw the graph that I showed you earlier, where most of the detections, most of the animals that we are looking at, actually they like the night. And you see most of them are 100% nocturnal, right? And there's a reason why they like that. It has to do with their life history, it has to do with their ecology. It also has to do because maybe a lot of them have been pushed to have those habits based on the activity that happens during the day. And so taking this into account is also incredibly important to be able to protect the area. So what you see here are just the distribution of the pink points here are the cameras, and then you can see the distribution of the measurements based on where there are no border lights and where there are border lights, right? So those yellow circles are where you see border lights. So the border wildlife study has no lights. Most of the points of the border road, and we don't see any light pollution. But this is something that we have to keep an eye on, because if whatever continues to happen, if there's any sort of additional development because of the roads, just the fact sometimes that the vehicles can access places that they couldn't in the past, that could actually affect also problems with light and pollution. So this is just another look at some of the key species that these are the most common nocturnal mammals, right? And so this is how they are distributed by block. So remember, what you were seeing is that block 15 and block 10 would be at the sort of like the extreme points where the light pollution, where the construction of the border was approaching. So those two are the key ones to keep an eye on. Desert cottontail, for example, over here, looks like it dominates the block 10. Block 15 seems a bit more even. And then this next graph is showing you some of the rarest ones, right? And so of course, here we have the mountain lion and the ringtail and the bats, the American badger, and black bear. So those rare species that are really sensitive to any sort of disturbance, either sound, light, or anything that we can see. And you can see how the sightings in these at the extreme of the study in these two blocks are where we have the most detections, right? So that's something to keep an eye on. This is an image. This is an example of how the light pollution looks like, at night. Like, this should not be there at all. This is one of the lamps that they've been installing along the border. So now let's talk about habitat. The main challenge or the main goal of our study was to study fragmentation based on the border wall. And so habitat is a really key component. And so not only we installed the cameras to just study the composition of the community of the animals, but we also wanted to generate, if you want to model and if you want to study what the cameras are detecting, so that's your dependent variable, right? Like number of species, what kind of species, and detections. You have to understand what is actually driving those differences between blocks and between different cameras. And to do that, we had also the amazing help of Brown River Conservation and the group of students that, if you were tuning last week, you probably saw a lot of their great work. And we did some vegetation surveys from each camera, right? Going 50 meters out of each camera in different directions to really understand everything that was surrounding the cameras. So how the habitat look around each camera, so that we can have an idea of all the different covariates, all the different drivers of wildlife appearances or not. So the way you do this, you have these transects, and then every systematic distance, you're checking what kind of vegetation and what kind of habitat structures, like rock or like burrows, or if you have canopy cover or you have just grasses and these kind of things. And so these are some of the results. Again, you're seeing the blocks up top. So the block 10, and 11 in the Patagonias, and so on, all the way to the Huachucas. And then you can see the numbers at the bottom of the graph with the bars. That's the camera number, right? So just camera 1, camera 2, camera 3. So you can see how there's quite a bit of variation even within block. And that's something that we are going to do some additional, start like modeling around it, and how that variation changes from between cameras, between blocks, and between regions. And so, and you can see the type of vegetation that was collected, that we collected data for. So we have either mesquites or oaks, manzanita, junipers, cottonwood, walnuts, willow, shrubs, succulent, or grasses. Of course, the San Rafael Valley has a very disproportion of grasses, but then as you go higher elevation into the mountains, then you see more canopy cover. This is just a sort of aggregation of that data by region, but this is actually something that we did too, but from space. So to do this, we use satellite imagery around the cameras, also establishing this 50 meter buffer around each camera. This was 100-meter buffer around each camera, and so you can see from space what is the canopy cover. What you can tell with this kind of data is actually the composition, but that's why it matches really well with the vegetation surface we did in the field. So again, the Patagonia is having more canopy cover than the other two regions. And then in terms of habitat, based on the surveys that we did, here you can see different things. So what about burrows or logs? That having a log in front of the camera might completely change the type of animal that you're seeing. Maybe you see more mice, or maybe you see more reptiles, rocks, streambed, and trails. And it's interesting because block 10, so in the Patagonias, where we've seen most of the detections and most of the species, you see how there are higher number of rocks, which maybe provide habitat for a lot of the small mammals. And then we also have some number of trails, which there's research that has shown that animals actually do like to use trails, like coyotes and some of the felids, just because it's more energy efficient, and why wouldn't you use one of those things? Oh, this is just repeated, but here the same thing. If you want to see a different picture, that's an example of a squirrel using some rock for habitat. And the reason why this is important is because as you're studying the region, you can then say, okay, what is the relationship between canopy cover, for example, and the number of species of mammals detected? And it turns out that you start uncovering these patterns, right? So mammals do like having more canopy cover. This is totally understandable based on the three-dimensional habitat that it creates, and shades and microclimate and different things. So now let's move to our favorite species, joking, the cows, which are also an important element of the region, right? So again, the same display with the Patagonia, San Rafael, and the Huachuca Mountains, and what you're seeing is the number of detections of cattle in each of these areas, right? So pretty high, block 15, block 13, the San Rafael Valley, pretty much all of them except block 12, which has been excluded in some areas for that. And then block 16 in Mexico also, with a sort of like relatively high number of cattle. And this is analysis that is in progress, and we still need to do more. But the question was like, well, do we see with some of the species that are also very common, do we see associations, some type of negative or positive relationship based on cattle? So far, we haven't detected anything that is like really telling. But this, as I was saying, requires a bit more analysis. So what you see here is just number of cows on the x-axis, and number of javelina, white-tailed deer on the right, coyotes on the lower left, and then all mammal species. So no pattern there. Like that's just like watermelons. My statistics professor used to say that looks like watermelon seeds on a blackboard if you spit them out. That's a joke. So the reason why also understand. Yep.
Hello, Zoe has some story to share about the cattle.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's true.
No
Zoe.
worries. Yeah, well, hi everyone. I'm Zoe. As Emily said, I've spent a lot of time out checking these wildlife cameras over the past year now, or 14 months. And so, yeah, going off what Paolo said, a lot of our detections are at night, or not when we're out in the field, because we're driving in trucks, we're walking with volunteers, we're talking. So often wildlife is scared away. But the animal I do see a lot of while I'm out checking cameras are cows. And I see them grazing. I see the effects of grazing, cow pies. We've even seen one dead cow, unfortunately. Well, smelled it and then saw it. But we see a lot of cows. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about how they impact our cameras. So Emily talked about attaching cameras to oak trees or even sotolls. But a lot of our cameras in the middle of our study in the San Rafael Valley in the grasslands are, there's no trees, there's nothing to attach them to. So we have to make little rebar tripods that we stick just a little bit into the ground, and we set the cameras up to be able to detect wildlife. But unfortunately, without a lot of trees, there's not a lot of great scratching posts for cows. So these rebar tripods serve that mode as well. So we get a lot of cows roaming up along on the rebar, and a lot of funny photos of really up close selfies of cows. And then unfortunately, a lot of times they knock over the tripods as well. So that's been an ongoing struggle. for the last year, going back and resetting up the cameras and all of that. But it has led to some positive collaborations with other land users, particularly ranchers in the area. So in the San Rafael Valley and even going into the Huachuca foothills. So there's one rancher in particular that always comes out to say hi when we're in the area, and we've seen him picking up and rearranging the tripods that his cattle have knocked down. So that's something that's led to a lot of collaboration, and we appreciate all of their support. And any other ideas on, low impact ways to deter cows are definitely welcome. So that's all.
Thank you, Zoe. Yes, and just to complement that, to say that log 16, you're noticing some differences with the detections there, and actually part of the problem was what Zoe was saying is that if you don't have trees around, especially on the grasslands area, cows are, they can be a bit punks, and so they will mess with the cameras. Okay, so. Well, sorry, I was going to, so the reason why also understanding what the pattern distribution of cows, the number of detections, is because, as you all know, we are in an exceptional drought that is not looking good, and last year was especially bad. And now the good news now is that we know now that Coronado National Forest is, because of the drought, actually planning to reduce the number of cattle that will be allowed to graze in areas of the national forest. And this, I mean, this is really good news. It's very important because it's a response to what is happening, and we'll probably be able to detect these over the coming months. So it'll be interesting also to see what happens to vegetation around these areas. I know Megan also has to say something about fire. Megan is our wildlife specialist. She goes through every single of these pictures, and so she basically has seen everything that happens in the area, including fire.
Yes, one of our cameras on block 12 was hit by a natural wildfire back in, I think, May or June of last year. And it's been so interesting to see the regrowth over those last few months. But specifically, I want to talk about these series of photos that really illustrate the drought that's been happening over the last year or so. It's a time series starting in March of 2020, right at the start of our study. And it goes through the monsoon of August of 2020, and it was kind of a non-soon, but there's still some green up. But looking at this February of this year, you can really see how the lack of rain plus the added grazing has really reduced the vegetation cover. Back in March, that was kind of normal grassland and things were able to reseed, but nothing's growing this year. And going through 2 million photos, I was really able to see the grass grow, and this year it's not growing, so it's been kind of discouraging. So hopefully the reduction of cattle can give this landscape a bit of a break. See what happens next.
Thanks, Megan. And yeah, I think that's the hope is there's hope in the cattle management strategies, also in the hopefully what happens with the monsoon, hoping that it's not a monsoon this year. And so continuing, just like to keep exploring the issue of drought, and this is one of the main findings or results that we want to talk to you about. This is the daily mean or average mammal and bird detections of bird and mammals. This is for the whole study. This is all our cameras in all the regions, and this is from the whole duration of the study, right? So like going back into early mid-March all the way into April of this year, and so you can see here that there's coming out of last winter, and I actually wasn't here in Tucson last winter, but I think it was, we talked about this, it was a relatively good winter in terms of precipitation. So coming out of that winter, then we have this steep decline moving into spring and summer of 2020, and then this pattern of detections of mammals and birds were picking up a little bit during fall, but then it didn't seem to go back up the way they were coming originally, sort of like coming out of winter and spring of 2020. So we haven't seen that. And of course, that to understand these kind of patterns from a a climate-induced perspective, you need much more data, you need more time because you want to see both short and long-term cycles. But it'll be interesting to see what happens if hopefully precipitation changes this coming year. Then we will have to, a very good comparison, even if it's just 2 years, about this pattern that we're seeing. These are here are just the similar data, but that I'm splitting by birds and mammals. This is the daily average detections. So a lot of the big declines actually that you saw on the previous graph happened because of birds mostly, right? I mean, they both have a downward tendency, but it's birds that significantly reduce the number of detections compared to early last year. So now let's move to a really important topic that Emily was highlighting at the beginning, and this is what is happening with the humans, right? So from an anthropogenic perspective, we have cows, and we talked about it. There's climate change, of course, but we also have the actual presence of humans. And these are our results in terms of number of detections based on human-related detections. So this is not just humans, but other things that relate to humans, like domestic dogs, for example, horseback riders, human and vehicles. And this is interesting. What you see here is that block 15 in the Huachuca Mountains, actually, this is closer to Coronel National Memorial. This is also the area when the border wall construction was approaching from the east. This is the block that detected the highest amount of human-related detections, most of them being vehicles. So what we have here are a total of 69% of these were vehicles, 6% horseback riders, 24% humans on foot, including, and most of the time actually being our field team, that we have to approach the cameras and change batteries and memory cards and that kind of stuff, hikers, and potential people crossing the border, right? And in terms of dogs, we have 20 domestic dogs. This is freezing a little bit. Here we go. So vehicles, or sorts of vehicles, that can include these construction vehicles like these, really messing up around the habitat. Same, the border wall constructions, you can see a deer there on the left, and I believe that's a tank truck on the right, if you can see it. And this is the time series of human detection. So this is just humans, right? Like, so no vehicles, no dogs, no those things associated with them. But you can see this trend. So in the coming out again, sort of like coming out of last spring, last winter, it's the hiking season. Most people are around. It's also better to go to the field. It's easier for people, like anyone that is doing field work. And then things really go down during summer, and they start picking up again during fall. Then after January, during January 2021, early February, we do have this spike in activity, which we can't be certain for sure, but that's the time where a lot of the construction was being hurried, like the last weeks of construction were being hurried. There was a lot of activity happening. We also documented this through other means, not just the cameras, but we had people going to the field and taking pictures and taking video of how that activity was spiking. So a lot of these, as we said, was just mostly activity from Border Patrol and construction, not from any other type of human activity, like crossing the border. And this is just to exemplify, some of the images that we see on A. So upper part to the left, those are Zoe and Brian. So that's our staff doing their job. And then B, we have people doing vegetation service. Then we have in C, looks like a reporter. And then on D, we have a hunter, perhaps. No, yes, sorry, actually, you can see a hunter and a hunting dog. And then at the bottom, what you see on E is that's possibly someone that's crossing at night, and then to the right, crossing the border at night, and then to the right, where you see that the same location, same camera, and that's Border Patrol tracking that person, because that's just a few hours later. This is an example of a hunting dog. they're running around, sometimes free with the colors. Horseback riders. And then, this is another time series like the one that Megan was showing you with fire and with the impact of cattle. But what you see here is this is July 2020. This is, before, the construction happened, and then just a few weeks later, that's when they start cracking the mountain up and to build that access for and the road, and then for you can see on the right side that's the line where the border, where the wall actually was built. And this is how it looks like November 2020. So that's really a disgrace. Okay, well, that was the data that we have so far. I want to emphasize that there's a lot more going on and a lot more data and ways of analyzing it and covariates, and we have to do all the more the statistical analysis ahead, and we'll be working a lot during the next months to actually get that published, and we'll share it with you, of course, first, and then we'll be able to look more at causality effects and more interesting patterns. But we wanted to tell this story with these numbers we have so far because we think it paints a really clear picture of what is happening. So I'm going to turn it, pass it back to Emily so that she can tell you more about what's next and what's going to happen in the next months with our study. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Paolo. Well, it's been, like we started, it's been such a huge year, and I really appreciate the team sharing so much of the detail of what we've been learning over the year. The purpose of this is not just to be a scientific investigation, but really to put this information to work so that we can be using it to have science-based border policy going forward. I want to set the context for what's happening right now along the border in terms of border wall policy as we understand it. And it's something that we've been following very closely for many, many months. We're part of a border coalition of a number of other conservation, environmental, and humanitarian organizations that are concerned about recent trends in border wall policy. After the inauguration, many of the contracts went into review under the Biden administration, and it's been a non-transparent process. We haven't known who's actually reviewing the contracts and to what end and who's leading that process. But what we have just learned and are celebrating now is that President Biden has canceled military funding for wall construction. So the Department of Defense funding that was moved away from its original purpose into border wall construction has been canceled. What canceling means is there's going to be a very complicated, no doubt, and expensive contract termination process for all of the border wall contracts that were funded with that military funding. For Arizona, this is tremendous news because it means that the Southwest Valley constructors and fisher contracts in the southern border of our state are due to now be ended. So that's a huge celebration. We're really excited about that. We're not out of the woods because congressionally funded wall projects in neighboring states are still a threat to the landscape, and they could continue. The big advocacy ask for our coalition and for the public in general is to be asking Congress to reappropriate funding from fiscal years 2018 and 2019 away from wall construction. If Congress can remove that funding, that's the simplest way for the other border wall contracts to be stopped. And that's going to take a lot of work to make sure that that reappropriation is possible. And stopping the wall is just the beginning. This is a very serious, significant change that has happened along many, many miles of the U.S. Mexico border. And when the wall stops, we really will be looking at severely impacted landscapes, some completely blocked by border wall, others where we have really serious concerns of erosion. The road networks that have been put in are a huge risk to our watersheds. We have experiencing a lot of vegetation loss. And there is still the possibility that new border infrastructure, even if it's not wall, will go in, including roads and lighting like Paolo was talking about. So it's going to continue to be a very serious issue to engage in. How can we best protect wildlife habitat in places by not putting in incompatible border infrastructure, and how to start reversing some of the damage that's been done from the really quick construction of roads and walls that happened over the last years. So what our charge is going forward is to continue to monitor the wildlife community for change. We are very concerned about the impacts of the drought. The wildlife activity has dropped significantly as a result, likely as a result of this drying of the landscape. So when you combine drought and the damage that's being done to the corridor and the severing of the international corridor for wildlife, this is a really serious combination of threats for species. So we will continue and expand our effort to document the wildlife community in this area. We are sharing our methodology with other researchers that we hope are going to replicate our study in other parts of the U.S. Mexico border. And we're going to be sharing this information to help guide border strategy. Through the Border Coalition, we contributed to a paper that went to the Biden administration that described the priorities for restoration. We included our border wildlife study to describe the importance of this area of Southeast Arizona for not only stopping wall construction, but to remove infrastructure. And we will continue to share these data so that it can help hopefully inform where we're going to do restoration. We're in conversation with land managers like Coronado National Forest and Coronado National Memorial about what kind of projects we could do first and to triage some of the damage that's been done from existing construction. And it's really our vegetation data and our wildlife data that are going to help us understand what the community was prior to construction, and will be that baseline then for us to monitor, hopefully, the restoration and improvement of this land over time. So finally, I think you all can imagine how much effort it's been to set up these cameras, check them every 6 weeks, process 2 million photographs, and understand the patterns in these data within just a year. I'm so indebted to the team who have spent countless hours literally working on this project, our volunteers that have contributed over 1,500 hours going out to be with us in the field, boots on the ground, like Britt Rosso. Thank you so much for all of your effort. He's an honorary staff member at this point. And we're really grateful also to our partners in Sonora, Naturalia, and the Round River Conservation Study students that spent 3 months adopting our project and collecting much of the data that you saw about the vegetation and the dark sky. This project really wouldn't be possible without the support that we've had. This has really taken over our organization in so many ways, and it's been a rallying cry for us to focus on this important part of the border. You're going to be hearing from us again as our study continues, as the border wall story evolves, and we'll keep watching the species count as more and more animals show up on our cameras in the coming months and years. So with that, thank you, and we're happy to take any questions that have come up.
Hi, Emily, thank you. We had one question from Tim. If we can discuss our relationship with the Forest Service and ranchers and how we collaborate with them and how we plan to share results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Well, a majority of our cameras are certainly on Coronado National Forest, and this is an agency that we've been working, that Skyland has been working with for many, many decades, really since the beginning of the organization's founding. We are in close communication with the forest biologist and the ranger staff about our work. We've been actually helping them know what's been going on in terms of border construction when that was active, where closures were happening. We were in touch with them about wildfire and prescribed fire that have happened. They'll be our first call if we do get any threatened or endangered species showing up on our cameras. And our goal is to work with them and share all of our data so that they'll be in the best position to prioritize restoration on their lands as hopefully mitigation funding comes in. So we had an opportunity to present these data to the leadership of Coronado National Forest last week, and they've been really eager to see these results. So yeah, all of our data is going to be shared with them, and we look forward to figuring out what the first restoration projects that we can do together. And I know they're looking at us to help be hands on the ground to make that happen.
Great. Zoe, I have a question for you. I think you can answer from Mike. Have you any comments on camera theft or intentional damage?
For sure. Yeah, thanks. Well, Sky Island Alliance, we've been working with wildlife cameras for years. And what's different about this study, what Emily kind of touched on, is we took out the bias in camera placement. So in a lot of other work we do with cameras, we're setting them up along wildlife corridors or at springs, which are also places where a lot of humans go. So we actually expected, we're used to seeing some intentional damage or theft on cameras, as are all organizations who put cameras out. And so we expected to see that, but we actually haven't seen that at all on this study. So we haven't had a single camera stolen. And on trees, we have those locks, which could be cut through, but even the rebar, we use a small 1/2-inch plastic zip tie. So they easily could be taken, but they're not being taken. And in terms of damage, I think we've had one camera damaged, and that was the one that was in the wildfire. So it was able to preserve the SD card with the data, but the camera did have to get retired. So we're really grateful and pleasantly surprised.
And I can say, I think the things that are damaging the cameras most are the cattle by scratching them, but they don't need to. I think we're just lucky they haven't stepped on them yet. I think that's all the questions we have so far.
I did see something early in the chat about automation of the data processing, and there are artificial intelligence platforms that are being trained and tested for data sets like ours to see if computers are as good as Megan in detecting wildlife species. And the short answer is they're not good enough yet for the quality that we want in this study. Megan has actually not only screened all of the 2 million plus photographs, but she's been able to make observations about some of the species that we've seen that we don't think computers could, such as hooded skunks, which is one of the 4 species of skunks in our region. She's found 8 different phenotypes, different physical patterns on the coats of these skunks, just by looking at the ones appearing on our cameras. So there's such a gold mine within this data set, and we're still relying on expertise of our wildlife staff to glean that data. And I think we're going to be learning by reanalyzing these photos over time with specific questions. We're going to be able to pull out even more insight into the ecology and the natural history of these species over time.
One question came in from Catherine that I can address is what images of the fire were detected on the camera. And I was able to see the fire approach from probably 100 feet away. It was getting closer and closer and closer. And you can't do anything about it because it already happened. But I was like, oh no, it's like seeing a flood come. So the fire came up, you can see the flames. Then all of a sudden it came on the ground and then it was just ash. It was like a movie. So see these kind of time lapse things as these cameras take the pictures. And, but like the day after, there was raccoons and lizards already back in the ash as smoking in the background. So it's amazing how fast the animals can recover and get out of the way and come back. I like Mike's move over the cameras.
Yeah.
All the questions so far. Any more?
All right. Well, thank you all for your support and sharing information with your friends and family about this area. We are so charmed and in love with the borderlands here in the Sky Island region, and we hope that this insight into the wildlife habitat and the wildlife community at the border has inspired you as well. So with that, have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.